Hi, everyone. I'm Harrison Roos, Director of Campaigns at the Canadian Chamber of Commerce. I'm happy to be moderating today's discussion on community recovery with Suncor, the Suncor Energy Foundation, Mikisew Group of Companies, and Community Foundations of Canada. As we begin, let's all take a moment to acknowledge and reflect on the Indigenous lands that we're all joining from across Canada. Today, we're going to hear from leaders from Suncor, the Suncor Energy Foundation, Community Foundations of Canada, and the Mikisew Group of Companies about how they work together across sectors to support communities during the response phase of the pandemic, what they've been learning, and the opportunities ahead as Canada moves further into recovery. This work is particularly important for the Canadian Chamber, as our members in all sectors across Canada have been exceptionally thoughtful and determined leaders over the past 15 months to make sure we're all able to get through this COVID crisis together. The format of today's event will begin with some introductions and opening remarks, followed by discussion of two case studies, one featuring Suncor Energy Foundation and Community Foundations of Canada, and a second featuring Suncor and the Mikisew Group, followed by a general discussion with the full panel, and then Q&A. Today, as communities slowly emerge from the pandemic, businesses have a role to play in working alongside community leaders and organizations to revive local economies and help citizens reconnect. Having businesses and communities come together to address the impacts of the pandemic and build a stronger Canada is crucial. And in a second, we'll hear from our leaders here, and they're doing that work each day. But before we do, I want to do just a little bit of time travel. It might feel like a lifetime ago, but really it's just 15 months ago, almost to the day. We'd all been hearing a little bit on the news about a new bug that was going around, but otherwise we're mostly going about our business, planning shifts, trips, earnings reports, and maybe even a summer holiday coming up soon. And then the shoe dropped. But it wasn't just a shoe dropping. It was all the shoes, everywhere, all at once. Suncor is a company, like others, that has experienced managing a crisis. But what happened 15 months ago was different. It was an emergency on all fronts, all at once. Energy prices dropped, supply chains were shut down, local plants operated with only essential workers, families didn't have childcare and weren't allowed to go see their loved ones, and nobody really knew how long any of this would last. The situation demanded an unprecedented response. And now with that reality of what we're all facing on this day 15 months ago top of mind, I'm going to turn it over to our panelists to first introduce themselves and their organizations and their backgrounds, but I also invite them to give a little bit of context on what their world looked like on this day 15 months ago. Let's start with Laurie Hewson, Director of Community Investment and Social Innovation at Suncor and Executive Director of the Suncor Energy Foundation. Laurie?
Hello, everyone. I am Laurie, as Harrison introduced me, and I am calling in today from the traditional territories of the Niitsitapi and the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Siksika, the Piikani, the Kainai, the Tsuut'ina, and the Stoney Nakoda First Nations, including Chiniki, Bearpaw, and Wesley First Nations. I was born and raised on these traditional lands, and the city of Calgary is my current home, and one that I'm really proud to be a part of. And it is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. So as Harrison mentioned, I work for Suncor, and specifically I lead the work of the Suncor Energy Foundation. And I've been with the company for 17 years, so I've seen quite a number of trends over the years. For those of you that don't know anything about the Suncor Energy Foundation, we are a charitable entity established in 1998 by Suncor, who is the sole donor, and it is our accountability to make contributions to the community in alignment with Suncor's purpose. There's lots more information about us and the work that we do on the Suncor website, so I encourage you to go there if you're curious and want to know more, or by all means reach out to me or to us, anyone on our team. I won't get into too much about me and my background because I think a lot of that might be in the bio, but I wanted to say that in many respects, I feel like I have one of the best jobs in our company. And really that's because I get to work alongside passionate people who are committed to ensuring the well-being of community and who know how critical it is to the well-being of business as well. This means that most of our work is done in relationship with others such as Melanie with Community Foundations of Canada, and even my colleague Debbie from within the company. And we get to learn from and work alongside folks like this to help strengthen communities. So Harrison asks a really big question about where was I 15 months ago. It's a complicated, probably almost a complex question. Um, I was just returning from Ottawa, where I'd been at the Inspire Awards with a group of young Indigenous leaders, elders, Suncor colleagues, and senior leaders. And this is an event that we've participated in annually since 2003, and it's often the highlight of our calendar for the year. At the same time, actually, as I recall, I was had done a lot of traveling up until that point, like so early on in the year. So I was quite exhausted and really looking forward to coming home and being home for a little bit. Ironic given how long I've been at home now. But I share that as a reflection because there was a lot going on at that time, but it's been a really powerful kind of reminder for me, considering that we recently hosted the online version of that same event. So it was really wonderful that we were able to still come together in community to connect with one another and to celebrate. But it also demonstrated to me the continued inequalities that we're facing and how much more prevalent they are. And in this case, it was about the ability for the young people who were at home in their communities and the challenges that they had being able to connect into our virtual event. And we hear a lot about that these days in terms of the digital divide, and it was very much present in that situation. So these two events and all that has happened in between really speak to me about the paradox of these times. So how much has changed, how much has not changed, and it has me really thinking about what we're going to do about that going forward. So thanks, Harrison, for the opportunity to introduce myself, and back to you.
Thank you, Laurie. Now let's meet Debbie Noseworthy, Suncor's Manager of Supply Chain Management, Indigenous Business Development.
Hi, everybody. Thanks, Harrison. So like Laurie, I am also in Treaty 7 and the Métis Nation Treaty 3 or 3, based in Calgary, west side of Calgary. Beautiful sunny day here today. Like Harrison said, I am in supply chain group. I'm in supply chain management sustainability group, where we work with our supply base on 6 focus areas. 2 of them being environmental and 4 of them are social. These current focus areas, of course, one of them being Indigenous business. I've been with Suncor, again, to what my bio says, for 17 years now, 4 years in this particular role, working with Indigenous suppliers across Canada and business activities for Suncor. Like Laurie, I maybe arguably, I think I have the best job at Suncor, but you know, that's okay. We can have 2 best for sure. And going back 15 months ago, I think for me, the first moment of holy smokes, this is a real thing, was at the Suncor Energy Center. There is a little daycare center that's out, you know, outside of our organization, but there was a little that was exposed, and it sent a lot of people home real quick, and it became, like I said, real quick. I am recently moved, but I was outside of the city in Cochrane, so it was quite a commute. So I remember initially thinking, yeah, this is good. This is nice. This will be fun. And I thought for sure it'll be no longer than a week. So yeah, boy, was I wrong. And then I'll get into the other things on how we reacted fairly quickly on the business activities with our Indigenous suppliers.
Thanks so much, Debbie. Now let's hear from Malik Eid, the Vice President for Corporate Strategy and Development with the Mikisew Group of Companies. Malik?
Thanks, Harrison. Hi, everyone. Malik Eid, I'm the VP Corporate Strategy and Development with the Mikisew Group of Companies. I'll argue I actually probably have the best job, period. For those who aren't familiar with the Mikisew Group of Companies, we're the off-reserve economic development arm, independent economic development arm of the Mikisew Cree First Nation. Most of our work centers in the oil sands. I'm actually on Enoch Reserve, where our corporate office is in Treaty 6. The Mikisew Cree First Nation itself is a Treaty 8 First Nation with their traditional territories predominantly where the oil sands lie. So we work closely with industry. In my capacity, I oversee the business development function for the Mikisew Group of Companies. along with our what we call our third-party limited partnerships and joint ventures. So we have 10 majority-owned partnerships, all very active in the oil sands and some outside of the oil sands as well. I also work closely with the community on other economic development initiatives and oversee all the mergers and acquisition functions for the group of companies. It's obviously an extremely rewarding role, and we're proud to be one of the largest Indigenous owned businesses in the country. Very passionate about what we do and the impact we have both to our workforce and ultimately the community, the Mikisew Cree First Nation community. You know, similar story, I think 15 months ago, it was, you know, hearing about this little bug. I think the day it became real for me, I remember watching, I think Oilers were playing, I think it was Winnipeg that day, huge Oilers fan. You could see the Draisaitl dream catcher behind me here. I think they broke for a commercial and they advised that the NBA season was canceled, I think, that day. So that's when we knew it was a little bit more than a bug. And on the work level, I think I just returned, or it was, you know, a week or two prior from a Suncor Forge forum. We were quite busy. We were gearing up for our busiest year on record. I think our wholly owned workforce, that payroll run was about 870 people. So it was record breaking for us, and you know, definitely share some stories on the impacts we had and how we reacted and worked closely, especially with Suncor, to really mitigate a lot of the impacts.
Thanks, Malik. I don't have my Maple Leafs paraphernalia around, but we can commiserate together afterwards about our seasons.
We'll call.
Last but most certainly not least, I'm happy to introduce everyone to Melanie Thomas, Vice President at Community Foundations of Canada. Melanie?
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Melanie Thomas, and I am joining you today from the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people, also known as Toronto. But I must say, I am a prairie girl at heart, and I'm originally from Treaty 4 territory known as Regina, Saskatchewan. So I've just been blessed in my life to live, work, and play right across the country. I work with Community Foundations of Canada, CFC as we call it. It's a national network to 191 community foundations, with over 90% of Canadian communities having access to a community foundation. So wherever you're calling from, your city, big city, smaller town, anything in between, you probably have a community foundation nearby. They mobilize local knowledge, leadership, and financial capital to support initiatives that benefit communities that need it most. And it is one of the country's largest philanthropic networks with over $7 billion in collective assets. And so prior to joining philanthropy, my background is in law and business. So I started my career in corporate law at Goodman's LLP, and then transitioned to Scotiabank, and then joined CFC. And I'm just going to say it, I got the best job. I'm just going to, last one, I can do the mic drop, I have the best job. And if I think back to the beginning of March, a little bit before the pandemic was declared, I was getting ready for sun, bourbon, and jazz. I had my bags packed. I was planning to head to New Orleans for a trip. And I was so excited about this trip. I rarely pack ahead of time. I'm not like 2 hours before my flight packer, but my bags are ready to go days in advance. And then I was seeing this swell globally of COVID spreading. And so reluctantly, but thankfully, I did cancel my flight. Couldn't quite unpack my bags yet. It did take me a couple days to actually unpack my bags and know the trip wasn't happening. But then we were watching this swell of the pandemic come here in Canada. And in those early weeks of March, even before the government declared a pandemic, it was incredible to watch communities right across the country mobilize to respond to the emergency we were facing. So we'll dive more into that today, but just want to say thank you so much for having me.
Thanks, Melanie, and thanks so much, everyone, for those scene-setting remarks for what we're going to get into here now. And I'd like to turn now to our first case study discussion with Lori and Melanie, who are going to dive into the pandemic response and recovery from the philanthropy perspective and how the Suncor Energy Foundation, Community Foundations of Canada, and other partners contributed and collaborated with communities and what they learned along the way. I'll pop in if there's any timely questions from the audience as we go. But otherwise, Lori and Melanie, over to you.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Harrison. So Lori, you shared with us about you were just coming back from Ottawa, but when COVID was declared, how did this immediately impact you, your team, your work? What did that look like?
Yes. See, this is where that was hard to pick just one thing in that introductory. Well, I'd say we kicked into emergency response mode, and rather sadly, we've had some experience in this before. Not on all fronts, in the past when we've had to kick into emergency response mode, it's been in response to events that have happened in specific communities, and like the Calgary floods in 2013, or the wildfires in Fort McMurray 5 years ago. So that's what happened. That memory muscle kicked in, and we were also learning what it meant to be working remotely. So I think similar to what you were saying, Melanie, we immediately started reaching out to community partners, colleagues, peers, because we've had this experience before. We knew what it meant to kick into gear around setting up some kind of roundtable of other funders and other businesses. And that's what we did. We just started reaching out to community, what was required. And at the same time, and this was a dynamic that was different, because it was happening on all fronts, the community kicked in, the company kicked into high gear. And so that's where we normally would have taken the lead on community response. We were suddenly internally trying to figure out how we were going to work together. And it was really awkward and messy and confusing. And this kind of beautiful response at the same time, because it's sort of like, everybody knew that there was something that we could be doing, and we knew that we could activate supply chain, different strengths that we would have necessarily in the past to really, I guess, really lean in and figure out what was required and what was needed. So as a result, there's a number of things that we ended up doing, like, so real tangibles, if that's what you're also wondering about. We were able to get PPE, not just for the company, but for communities. So reaching out to different communities to saying, what do you need? From a foundation perspective, we immediately let partners know that the grants that were coming their way or that they had already received didn't need to be for that program anymore that had been planned, because that program probably wasn't going to happen, but could be used operationally in whatever way was required to keep the organization going. So there's lots of examples of things that we did, but for me, more than anything, it was just that, how did we all come together and just try to figure it out?
Yeah, I think you should say that, Lori, like that, that difference of, for you, it was both the foundation and Suncor having to work together. I mean, that interconnectedness is completely what we saw in local communities right across the country. And from our perspective, it was the best multi-sector collaborative effort to respond. I mean, we saw frontline agencies, philanthropy, individuals, business, municipal governments, just triage in the most incredible way to say who needs support the most and how do we do that. And it's exactly what you're saying within the two organizations, but take that at a community level. One of my favorite stories is there was one of our community foundations in Saskatchewan. They were on the phone with the mayor's office 3 times a day. Yeah. 3 times a day, every day, saying what is the most pressing need, and what do they need, who do they need, where are they, and like, let's support it. And that was done so organically. Like, there was this breaking down of barriers or silos. I don't know what your experience is, but sometimes between sectors it can feel like this is your job and this is my job, and if we want to work together, we need to talk about it for 8 months. But I didn't see that during the pandemic. It was just, we're in this together.
Yeah, it was extraordinary to me too, because one of the things that, when you're entering into that kind of multi-sector collaboration, the amount of time that it takes to set that up, to have the, is everybody in agreement on the principles? Are we, but in that kind of an emergency response, there just seems to be a shared sense of purpose and principles by which it's almost an unspoken agreement. You just dive in and go. and that was quite remarkable. I think one of the challenging things in all of that for me is in that, and it wasn't just for me too, and my team, we've reflected on this as well too, is that we knew that there was a need to be responding to these things in the moment, and that was a really important thing. And at the same time, we knew that putting a pause in some of the long-term things that we were supporting, those kinds of initiatives, that could be potentially harmful as well, right? That we knew that some of the long-term initiatives that we had been supporting were also going to be important to help navigate what was ahead of us. Mm-hmm. So it was really difficult to kind of step back from that, to not be able to kind of progress some of that work while at the same time responding to the urgent needs. So it just was an interesting tension that we're feeling, and it's good to start thinking about those things again.
Right. I mean, we use the framework, I'm sure many others, of pause, pivot, or proceed, and we looked at that across all of our work. And I think we came back to that framing weekly. Like, is this still relevant? Should we pause? Should we pivot? Should we proceed? And you're just working in the unknown, right? And you're trying to make the best decisions possible in the moment. I mean, one amazing thing I think from this collaboration we saw across the country was we were able to provide that intelligence, especially to the federal government, in real time as to what we were seeing, and along with the many other voices in the sector. And a response from the federal government was the $350 million emergency community support fund. How do we just get money quickly? Nonprofits, charities serving those in the most vulnerable contexts. And what I loved, we didn't always get to do it, but because there was this organic community mobilization, in some ways we were able to tap into that to move the money faster from the federal government, and just forge relationships. I think so many new relationships were forged during that time. And a question on my mind is, as you say, as we move from this emergency to something into recovery or longer term, how do we not lose that?
Yes. Yeah.
That sense of, break down the barriers, work together, get to action.
Yes, exactly. Well, and maybe that's a good lead into the other question. So the conversations that we've been having, I've been so enjoying over the last little while about reflecting on this time and thinking about the future. And one of the things that we had done early on in terms of, what was our response to community, was reaching out to you, was reaching out to CFC to see, how can we get funds into communities to get dispersed in ways that we're going to have the most meaning. And you were working on something really interesting. Yeah. Maybe you want to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And CFC, because of our legal setup as a registered charity, as a foundation, we were able to just play the host organization to Indigenous leaders to start the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund. So completely governed by an advisory council of just Indigenous leaders to quickly support Indigenous ways of, in culturally sensitive ways of, how do we get support to Indigenous communities who need it most? And I think, your team to come alongside and say, how do we support them in what they're doing versus reinventing the wheel and everyone going off and creating their own thing, was incredible, to just flow funds and make sure we're working differently versus the way that we've always been working, which is someone like CFC running that, or someone like Suncor Energy Foundation running that type of a fund.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an interesting, for me, it's an interesting example of some of the things that we've also talked about around what does this kind of dynamic approach to a recovery phase, right? Because there are times when we need to still be responding to need. But it's a very dynamic shift. And by that, I mean, it's not a linear movement from, so we've been in emergency response mode. And now we're in recovery mode because there is this kind of blend back and forth. And we also know that the pandemic has made some of these inequalities, inequities much more visible. And so, and things that we can't ignore any longer. And so, you know, for me, the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund is a really great example of something that was born out of a response, but actually is a path forward to the future too, right? So it's an important part of recovery, but for me, it's also an important part of what will the future look like.
Yeah, and I think you're hitting on that point of, you know, even now, in some ways, it's, are we in recovery? Like the vaccine is rolling out, but are we? Because I hear, you know, rumors of a third or fourth wave, depending on where you are in the country, coming in August. And you can feel like, oh, we're moving forward, and then you feel like, you know, another stay-at-home order, and you're back. But, you know, if we're only reactionary, if we lose the intentionality of what we're building ahead, it's going to harm those in the most vulnerable contexts. Like that is true. And the cracks, the history of Canada of inequalities that have existed for Indigenous communities, Black communities, people of color, those with disabilities, seniors, like that has just, I feel like a bright light just shone on it during COVID. And so in my mind, as we move to recovery, it can't be going back to the status quo. Like the status quo just doesn't exist. These issues that have been in Canada throughout our history has been heightened, has been put in front of everyone's face. I don't think we can ignore the anti-Asian hate. We can't ignore the reckoning that Canada's facing right now with the discovery of the murder of 215 children in Kamloops. We can't ignore the terrorist attacks that happened in London. Like it's so much more beyond a pandemic, the reality we're facing. And so, you know, for leaders, for businesses, for philanthropy, for community organization, what are we doing to be intentional about how we are innovating so that we're not just creating more inequalities in our country? You know, I do think there needs to be an intentionality behind it.
I agreed. So in all of that, Melanie, I'm curious. So obviously pre-pandemic, CFC, you would have had a vision of where the opportunities are going forward. Has your perspective on those opportunities changed as a result of this ongoing event?
Yeah, you know, and I think it depends on some opportunities. Some opportunities you think, oh my goodness, we need that more than ever. One example being, you know, social enterprises and the need for a flourishing social finance market. You know, COVID showed, you know, the fragility of some of our community organizations and the need to modernize. And so I think in some ways we knew that before, but oh my goodness, if you wanted to see what that looked like, COVID was the time. In other ways for CFC, I think really, you know, for us, we're on this, I think the beginning steps of learning about anti-racism and what does that look like in our organization, and how is that not just a topic we talk about once in a while, but actually we're being proactive in it. And you know, what is the role of multi-sector players working together? Because we saw such a beautiful example of it and we saw such amazing outcomes. What does that look like going forward in the way that we operate? Because we're dealing with such societal issues versus that's a charity issue, you know, that's a business issue, that's a government issue. Like that, we don't see that way anymore.
Mm-hmm.
Can I turn that question back to you, Lori? How is that impacting where you're sitting and what you're seeing and the way you're working?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we probably are in violent agreement on many of these points. But where I do, you know, I guess I would just build on the points that you have raised and the way that we're, and I guess in the way that we're looking at it, and you know, agreeing with you, like the notion that there are other maybe models of financing that are complementary to what we've traditionally done in philanthropy, which is the, you know, the grant making side of things, but there may be other ways of looking at investing in different ways. Certainly we are, going to revisit some of our governance practices even. So in this journey of understanding all that, yeah, I think you said it so much more beautifully than I can probably. I'll just trip over it a little bit, but just in being honest, but just addressing inequalities and what does that mean? And so it not just looking at this from the perspective of a traditional philanthropic approach again, but what are other things that we need to look about in terms of our own practices, how we govern, all those kinds of things as well. So these are some of the questions that are on my mind and on our mind as a foundation entity. And I know that the company is talking about these things as well. So,
I think it's
a long road ahead.
There is a long road ahead. And I just would like to share that, one of the greatest privileges I had last year was meeting with different leaders from different equity seeking groups. And so, leaders from the Black community, Indigenous community, women leaders, Jewish community, South and East Asian community leaders, and there was some calls on philanthropy to say, we're a grassroots organization, we're small, we want to get food into the homes of single parent households, and we're struggling to do that because we don't have some charitable status. But also for the business side, I mean, we heard from business leaders from the East Asian community, especially saying our businesses are being boycotted. Anti-Asian hate is on the rise. And so, this commonality we heard was, this has always been happening. It's just that such a worst case, but it wasn't presented to us as this is a government issue, or this is a philanthropy issue, or this is a societal issue. And I do think there's kind of need a top-down, bottom-up approach that individual organizations, as you talked about, we're making changes, we're being honest about our weaknesses, and then a top-down of like, well, what is a society that we want? And what are we building towards? And if it's not in the right direction, then what are we doing to collectively change it? Yeah,
I agree. and I think you put that really beautifully. And it's really fascinating because lots of the things that the folks in the foundation team, we're tracking these sorts of things as well, and then obviously thinking about, and what does that mean from a business, in the business context, right? And so what and how are we tracking these kinds of emerging issues and taking that back into Suncor, to share that and to create that level of help to enhance, I guess, not to create, but to enhance the levels of awareness that are already from a more societal perspective. And again, I think we know and we recognize what our role is in society and in communities, and what's how do we kind of adapt so that we are keeping pace with the changes that are happening and what's being asked of us.
Right.
And
well, sorry, Lori.
No, it's okay.
Well, I was just going to say that there's an opportunity here, right, for every organization, small, medium-sized businesses, funders, government. There's an opportunity because we've had to innovate. No, I don't think anyone has been left unchanged in the process of the last 15 months. And in that necessity to innovate and to pivot or to adapt, there is so much opportunity to create something that's more just and sustainable. And so, I know Lori and I can talk forever, Harrison, and so I am watching the time. And I know there'll be time for some more discussion later on. So maybe we will pass the mic back to you, Lori, unless there's anything else that we didn't. Okay.
Thanks. I was going exactly where you were headed. So I did, Harrison. I'm not sure if there were any. We'd given you right to intervene with any questions that came up or to stop us. So if there's anything.
I'm going to intervene with one quick point or one quick question. One of the things that you mentioned is that you're in regular contact with communities throughout and basically asking, what are your needs? How can we help? I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about what you were hearing from the other organizations, but even within your own organizations. How did the needs evolve over 15 months? Like, I remember a time where the biggest crisis was, how do we get face masks to people? and how do we get hand sanitizer? Then it's how do we get rapid tests? Can we get rapid tests? Then it's now it's vaccines and reopening plans. And so I'm just curious if you could talk about from your perspectives and the conversations you've been having, how have the needs evolved over the last 15 months up to where we are today? Maybe Lori first, or Melanie, you go first. There you go.
Oh, sorry, Harrison. I'm going to blame the Zoom lags on every time that I just get so excited and jump in. I think that the regression you talked about is real. Like what we as Canadians face in this country as needs progress, you see that reflected in community. I think for the populations that organizations are serving, thinking through what is more sustainable practices is starting to come back into the conversation versus just, what we need is face masks, what we need is supplies for learning, what we need is, transportation for seniors to their appointments. I think for organizations in the charitable nonprofit sector, a lot have really struggled, right? Like a lot of their funding comes from in-person events that all were completely stopped. And so I think there's a need for support for the sector to modernize and to recognize that the way that we worked for the last 100 years in the context of COVID, in the context of technology, in the context of the needs of today, do need to change. And the point of really supporting the communities and the leadership that represent the communities they serve, there needs to be support for that. And Suncor Energy Foundation coming alongside and supporting Indigenous leadership through the Indigenous Peoples Resilience Fund is just an example of what we need to see just across the board with so many other communities. And so I do think that the calls are changing into more of a long-term view.
Yeah, thanks. And I guess what I would say that this, just to build on Melanie's point, because everything, you've raised an important question, Harrison, because it's a both and response. And I think in our conversation, our dialogue, we were focusing more on just what Melanie was talking about is there are the needs for physical safety for sure. The things like PPE, rapid testing and all that. So that we get back out into community. And there's this real need to to be addressing some of these broader issues that are just going to help, that are just going to make life better for everybody. And that's been a real strong theme or action within the philanthropic community that we're all active participants in. And so like I said, it's a both and. So I'm glad that you asked the question, because we did steer more to the and what does this all mean going forward to once we're kind of through the urgency of this.
Well, thanks. I think it's an important topic, sort of every aspect of it, and so just trying to cover it all is tough to do in 15 or 20 minutes, but you did very well. And thank you to both of you and your organizations for all the work that you've been doing over the past 15 months and 17 years. And I'm sure you'll be continuing to do as well into the future. Now I want to turn to our second case study. And for that, I'd like to welcome back in Malik and Debbie. And they're going to talk about how Suncor and the Mikisew Group of Companies have worked together to realize new partnership opportunities within Suncor's supply chain that benefited business and communities, what you've each learned in your management of the pandemic response in your organizations. Again, I'll chime in if there are any questions that come in, and a reminder to folks watching, if you do want to put a question in, just hit that question and answer button, Q&A button down at the bottom of your Zoom screen, type it in, and I'll pop the question into our panelists when the time arises. But with that, Malik and Debbie, over to you.
Perfect. Malik, do you want me to kick it off and set the stage?
Ladies first, go ahead.
All right, perfect. So, 15 months ago, at the very beginning stages in our response to the pandemic, we very quickly reached into all of the communities that we work really closely with, the local communities and areas that we operate. And Malik mentioned before that, of course, there's the nation, and then there's the group of companies, so the economic development group. So that's our connection in. So we reached out to the economic development groups very quickly, and really two questions: what do you need and what do you have? And it was really meant to be a collaborative solution to get through what was certainly some crazy times. And through that, we saw a lot of amazing Indigenous suppliers help solution for us. We stood up the emergency response team, like Lori mentioned, and within that, there's a bunch of different groups trying to solution different issues. And of course, one of them is supply chain, trying to obtain all the services and the materials that are needed to get.
Malik, maybe you can jump in there and carry along. Debbie did promise that she would freeze at some point during the event, and it has happened on cue. So Malik, over to you here.
I'll be back soon. Yeah, I to continue that. I think the Mikisew Group of Companies it's a very unique company. Obviously, we're a for-profit business with not-for-profit characteristics. We're ultimately we exist to serve the Mikisew Cree First Nation and assist in their abilities. I mean, the majority of the funding that the Mikisew Cree First Nation receives, despite what some folks would think, is actually non-government financing. So a lot of that comes from the Mikisew Group of Companies and other industry funding. So I mean, the impacts of the pandemic, specifically the pandemic, and in our industry with oil prices falling the way it did, had a very material impact on our business and on the sector at large. The trickle down effects of what the group of companies does for the community is immense. We have a calculation or a metric that we calculate of net economic benefit to the First Nation, and it's essentially the sum of distributions that are made up to the First Nation, along with all donations, and more specifically the payroll benefits that are paid to the members of the Mikisew Cree First Nation. So to give you some context, with the March 31st fiscal year end, that total amount was about $20 million this year. And about half of that is actually made up of payroll benefits to the First Nation. So obviously, we placed a strong emphasis on trying to maintain the business, and really we're a labor services or a labor-driven business. So revenue means employment. We maintain a fairly high percentage of Indigenous employment. So we, on the onset, started working very, very closely with Suncor. Debbie and I and members from her team were connecting at least bi-weekly at the beginning of the pandemic, understanding the impacts to their business. In all honesty, within weeks of COVID-19 being announced as a global pandemic, we lost about 50% of our revenues as a business, and corresponding amount of jobs effectively at the group of companies. Very proud of our ability to react. We worked on some awesome consolidation efforts, specifically reference the work we did with Suncor and one of our partnerships. Obviously, one of their operations, being the Fort Hills operation that they have a majority stake in, was impacted pretty drastically by the pandemic and went down to one train of operations. And with that, we lost a significant contract, or temporarily suspended a significant contract there. And we were able to work with Suncor and actually increase our overall revenue with Suncor, despite all the challenges that we had during the pandemic. So that's a testament to, I think, how both of these organizations really work together. To Debbie's point, it was constantly, here's the business impact, here's a business update, but what can we do for the community? And we had very similar conversations with our leadership. Ultimately, the Mikisew Cree First Nation is centered on a reserve about 200, or a community 200 kilometers north of Fort McMurray, which has two reserves, called Fort Chipewyan. It's a fly-in, fly-out community with a winter road that's open a handful of months a year, 2 or 3 months at most. It was a time where I think, going back to last April, people were trampling each other at grocery stores for toilet paper and sanitization supplies and what have you. And here you're dealing with a remote community that, on the best of times had logistics challenges in getting stuff to the community. So that's an example of, we reached out to the community. Obviously, they were going to face shortages of sanitization supplies. We were lucky enough to have a partnership with a company called International SOS. Partnership's called Mikisew International SOS. And they're one of the global leaders in providing emergency services, fire and medical response. And we were actually able to source, and we created a kit essentially for 315 households, so both Mikisew households and non-Mikisew households that lived in the community, of hand sanitizer and gloves and masks and everything that there was a global shortage on in the world at that time, to really just assist the community. Another example, with trying to maintain social distancing. There's an elders lodge in the community of Fort Chipewyan that houses a handful, I believe about 8 or 9 elders. They were facing cook shortages and what have you. So we were able to use our contract actually that we have with Suncor, Mikisew Sodexo Limited Partnership, which provides on-site camp and catering. We were able to use that asset to prepackage meals, and we're continue to deliver those meals up to the community of Fort Chipewyan weekly, because they were facing cook shortages and wanted to maintain kind of social distancing in the lodge. So, we were super proud with our ability to react. It wasn't business as usual for us. My personal job shifted. I was the one that personally sourced those goods for the community of Fort Chipewyan. We're used to in-person meetings and being out and about and doing traditional business development functions. And that changed. And, it took some time to adapt. And, simply put, in our industry, a lot of, procurement initiatives that were put on hold. So our job shifted. I think it took a little bit of a little bit of time, and we really got used to it. And we went back to doing strategic initiatives. It actually afforded us the time needed to really invest in our business. And I know that's cliche, but we, about 9 months prior to the pandemic, we had done a large-scale acquisition of the Guthrie Group of Companies that nearly doubled our wholly owned business. And we were able to take that time as executive team to accelerate the integration efforts, consolidating some of our leases. We were transitioning to our inaugural independent board. We were able to take the time to spend some time, finalizing that transaction. And really, we had, a lot of really good strategic conversations with clients like Suncor. An example, we had a kind of a monthly call that we initiated with VP of mining and the general manager of one of the operations, and talked about, an equity opportunity that we were working on for a while, and really explained that opportunity. And it resulted in us making our largest capital purchase of an asset, and that asset is working on Suncor's sites today. So super proud of the relationship. Really, it was more than just, there were difficult conversations. I mean, we lost a lot of revenue, and we understood, and there was a sense of we're all in this together, and it was really a lot of checking up on each other, which we were super proud of, for sure. Looks like Debbie's back. Debbie, did you want to...
Yeah, so Debbie, Malik just did a great job there with introducing things from his perspective. We lost you sort of mid introduction for you, so I'll turn it back to you to conclude your introductory remarks and then leave the discussion for you two to carry.
Perfect. I'm curious to know what I missed, but for sure Malik would have presented it better than myself. So pandemic we talked about, and then right on the coattail of that was low oil. And we knew that there was a requirement for Suncor to reduce costs immediately, which included production in order to offset the cost of oil. So that meant some significant changes at our operation. I think I heard Malik talking about that. And what we knew that would come from that is there would be an impact on spend to all of our suppliers, including Indigenous suppliers that we work with. So we immediately got our head around what that would look like for the immediate term and the near term, and had discussions with the group of companies, such as Mikisew Group of Companies, on what that looked like. So Malik talked about they had 10 companies within their group, and we wanted to give them that bird's eye view of all 10, each and every area, so they can properly plan. I know that in the introduction, Malik also mentioned that the revenue from businesses is a significant impact back into the community, and this is what is required for them to do all the things in the community they need to do. So early discussions on what that would look like, not easy discussions, like Malik said, and significant decreases as well. So that was recovery, or that was response. And then we started to move towards recovery and what that would look like. And where is there opportunity? Again, what do you need and what do you have? And how can we all work together? And perhaps there was a shortage in one area that some of our suppliers could benefit from, and vice versa. We started to have discussions about recovery and looking to reverse some of that decline in spend and offset some of that. And Malik, I don't know, did you have an opportunity to talk about that work, or do you want to use that as an example? You did?
Yeah.
Okay. So the example came, to Malik's point about that additional work or that augmented work, I think is probably a better word, that Mikisew, one of the Mikisew companies, had started. There's some other examples of that as well. We had one company that lost a service, and to them it was a significant piece of business, but they also had skills and desire to do some wildlife management. And so while we weren't operating in one area, we certainly had the need to manage some nuisance wildlife, and so augmented with that as well. So it was really important to Suncor to continue to work with communities and Indigenous suppliers on opportunities that made sense. And Malik, I know you spoke about the capital investment and lots of discussion internally here at Suncor, as well as with the group of companies, on some sustainable work and what that would look like. Deeper engagement. Mikisew Group of Companies does such a phenomenal job on that. It is deeper engagement. It's not a partnership on paper. And I think that's what has got us through the other side of it. Did you want to add anything to that, Malik?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that captures it. I mean, I think obviously a lot of people and companies learned a lot during the pandemic. We were already down the path of, I guess, diversification of services. I think uniquely, when you look at our business on a consolidated basis, there were some segments that really struggled during the pandemic. And there were some that were actually the recipients of some additional work because of the pandemic. So, for example, we have businesses that do janitorial services, and with increased COVID-related cleaning and what have you, we had some increase in scope. We have a partnership with the First Transit Group that does transportation services in the region. And with the pandemic, social distancing and what have you, again, had an increase of scope. I think that really taught us the need to diversify our business. I think we have a very unique partnership. For those that aren't familiar with Suncor, actually, we jointly Mikisew owns just shy of 15% in the Suncor East Tank Farm facility. Another 30-some% owned by another First Nation community, and that was an example of an investment that wasn't necessarily impacted through COVID-related impact. So I think we're obviously Fort McMurray businesses are resilient. We've had to, we're always dealing with the unexpected. There was a fire, there was a flood during the pandemic that impacted a lot of offices and what have you. I can't say there were a lot of businesses or people preparing for something like this, but if we've learned anything over the couple of years, it's prepare for the unexpected. In our case, it's not just a single entrepreneur or a publicly traded company that's dealing with shareholders' returns. It's a community that largely relies on the distributions and the profits from the company. So we've placed a huge emphasis on maintaining a strong balance sheet to not impact our operations. I think we've come out of this, relatively strong from that aspect, and really, I think collectively in our industry, for the first time in a long time, there's a real sense of optimism with oil prices where they are today, and there is, I think, finally a sense of optimism. At least you'll see it once we can gather.
Yeah, exactly. And then I'd want to add, when we're talking about recovery, there's, we talked about the nuisance wildlife. We talked about the new work for one of your group of companies, as well as some existing work that has started back up again. But also at every opportunity, we talk about what else is available. What do you need? What do you have? And so we've got several companies helping us to get on the other side of this as well. Some Indigenous companies are doing some rapid testing. We have Indigenous company doing some vaccinations, and so we're just working closely together to find the right supply and supply opportunity for Indigenous suppliers.
Yeah, that's a good point, Debbie. Yeah, so very unique. Not every day an Indigenous company is performing these types of services, but again, our Mikisew International SOS service has been on the ground in for really all the major producers in the region, providing rapid testing and vaccination efforts in the region. So that's obviously benefiting the community at large, Fort McMurray, but also people that are flying in and out of operations there as well, and definitely a scope that we're really proud of to be able to assist the community in recovery of that.
Mm-hmm.
Can I step in with a supply chain question? And similar actually to what I asked Melanie and Lori, how has it evolved over the last 15 months? So like you mentioned, the early on supply chain is, how do we get toilet paper? When that was a serious challenge for supply chains globally. How has that sort of thing changed over the last 15 months? What were the pressure points? What are the pressure points now? I think of building supplies now are a pressure point for supply chains and prices there. So how has that evolved over the last year and a half, and how have you each adapted to that and learned from that and tried to predict what the next pressure point is going to be?
Yeah. So I would say we got really big really fast. So we went outside of our normal supply base to quickly get everything that we can. You talk about sanitizer and masks and all that personal protective equipment. So we got really big, and then which was required, and then now we're going to start to see that scale back again in terms of the amount of the suppliers. Like we go in big, we'll go back in, and that is a requirement as we need to reduce some of the operational costs and some of that efficiencies on leveraging spend and leaning in with all suppliers, including Indigenous suppliers, on some operational efficiencies and reductions of costs. So big, back down to what we were before, or potentially even tighter.
Yeah,
and it was required. Sorry, go ahead, Melanie.
Canadian level, there's a sense of, I think there's a place for outsourcing and global logistics, but I think even now with, COVID restrictions have largely been lifted in some global countries, but there's a container shortage, and that's impacting your supply chain as well. So, especially for essential supplies, masks was most prevalent in this. There'll likely be a shift to domestic manufacturing of some of these materials. Selfishly, I hope there's a shift to, you look at some communities that stepped up during the pandemic and started producing masks that they were selling, and I hope that means additional business opportunities for Indigenous communities. Again, unrelated to the question, I think there's been a heightened awareness in this country when it comes to Indigenous reconciliation, in our case, economic reconciliation. I think the grave discovery of 215 souls of, outside of Kamloops is a reminder of the atrocities, and I think absolutely there's a need for it. There's a place for businesses like ourselves, and we're hoping that a lot of the challenges that and experiences that we learned from this pandemic can translate into additional work for Indigenous businesses. And for those in the audience that aren't aware of some of these organizations, strongly encourage you to join the CCAB and Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, and learn more about some of these Indigenous businesses, and introduce it into your supply chain network for sure.
Mm-hmm.
Well,
and I would just add to that, Harrison, through the early stages, like the response stages, we did lean into the Indigenous supply base, and we had some remarkable supply that came out of that. And that work has been, there's because of the relationships and the gratefulness, there's additional work that is happening with those suppliers that may today not include sanitizer in bulk. It is something different. And so it's all these relationships as well. And yeah, it's important to us. We take those very seriously.
that's great. And thank you both very much for that discussion. I'm always personally impressed hearing about experiences like this, and how people such as yourselves have been able to lead communities and organizations through these sorts of challenges. So congratulations to both of you and your teams as well for all that you've done over the past 15 months, and as well will continue to do into the future. And speaking of the future, I'd like to welcome Laurie and Melanie back into the conversation as we move to our full panel discussion. And first, talking about the future, I want to put it to the group for the relatively near future, say over the next calendar year. As communities across Canada are starting to emerge from the pandemic in earnest now, what do you think some of the big challenges that you're each going to see are? And maybe let's start with Melanie. For this one, I'll put you on the spot, Melanie, to start.
Sounds good, Harrison. Thank you. So just so I'm clear, the question is like, what are the challenges that communities, like a broader communities, are facing?
Yeah.
Laurie and I were chatting before, I think what really came to the forefront over COVID: food insecurity, mental health crisis, racial injustice, wealth inequality, the gap. There's so much money, but the gap is bigger than ever. We need to grapple with that. These are the challenges, and it's not a government issue to solve. It's not a charitable issue to solve. It's not a business. It's all of our issues, because we're talking about issues that are so deeply embedded in society. And it's a call on all of our sectors to actually envision what community should look like, recognizing all of these issues that are right in front of us. And a tangible piece for the business community is to work with the chamber and to advocate for what a more just, resilient, healthy community looks like for all.
And maybe Debbie next. Sort of what are the challenges you think are, from your perspective, what are the biggest challenges you're going to be trying to solve over the next year?
I think one thing that we learned as industry throughout the last 15 months is one of them is that there's still a requirement for us to stay laser focused on cost. We'll continue to do that. In a very tough year, our dollar spend and percentage of our total spend with Indigenous suppliers increased. And that is because at every opportunity we look for and consider Indigenous business. So, last year we spent 10.6% of our overall spend was with Indigenous suppliers. We think that opportunity is, that runway for the next opportunity is 90%. And that's going to come from working with our non-Indigenous suppliers who are working closely with Indigenous suppliers. So I would encourage all of the companies on this call, as a Canadian organization, to understand through, to Malik's point, the Canadian Council for Aboriginal Business, or the Northeastern Alberta Aboriginal Business Association, NABA, understand where that supply is, reach into them, develop those relationships, and look to see at every opportunity where can you be engaging with Indigenous suppliers.
And then next, let's Malik, I'll turn it to you, and then Laurie after that.
Well, I'm an optimist, so we're, again, I think, optimistic on what the world's going to look like coming out of this, specifically for our sector. Looking forward to see kind of 2022 capital spends and what opportunities that presents in our marketplace. I agree. I think in our sector and more recently, we've all had to react to doing more for less. It's a very tough operating climate. I think a lot of I guess best managed organizations have truly invested in their business and their ability to be able to operate in higher volume activities and lower margin activities. So I think that's going to absolutely pose some challenges in the short term. A lot of COVID related adjustments and what have you that businesses have had to make. From an Indigenous business standpoint, I think again we really enjoy working with organizations like Suncor. Our region and the Fort McMurray region is unlike anything else you'll see when it comes to Indigenous business procurement practices and the emphasis placed in the marketplace. There's been pioneers in our industry, including our CEO Edward Coudray, who've been involved in organizations like NAPA for 30 plus years and really set the stage of best practices and how things could be done appropriately. So really optimistic on the Indigenous business front, and very similar conversations to what we're having with Suncor, and the emphasis they place on it, and we're having with other clients in the marketplace as well.
That leaves me. The conversation with Debbie and Malik reminded me of one of the other dimensions of the last 15 months that's been so challenging, which I think continues into the future, and that is how to do what we do, address all of the things that Melanie laid out so beautifully with fewer resources. And so there's a for me that's a real element of creativity in that, which excites me and terrifies me at the same time. But I think the other thing I would add to the comments is how important it will be for us to redefine what community means as we re-enter it, so to speak. We've, over the last 15 months, community has been redefined for us, and we're going to be moving back into a space where we're going to be physically in relationship with one another again. And what is it going to mean to feel safe? What will it mean to feel safe back in the workplace? What will it mean to feel safe with our families or extended families? And so, for me, that, that ties into vaccinations and some of that. And then there's also what it will mean for us to feel mentally and emotionally safe, and feeling like we're in places where we feel we belong. Again, after we've had these prolonged periods of separation from others, but also stepping back into a world that's going to feel a lot different than it did 15 months ago. So that will be a challenge.
A good question here from Julianne, and for answering this, let's go in just to see if everybody's paying attention. Let's go in reverse order from what we just did there. But I'll say as well, of course, jump in if there's something that I think, if there's something you think is important, by all means, let's have that sort of engagement as well. The question from Julianne is, how have relationships with your respective community and industry partners changed throughout the pandemic? Have they strained? Have they gotten stronger? Maybe both. And then as a second part, what do you credit for that change, Lori?
I would say mostly strengthened, but I think in the strengthening process, there's always a bit of strain. And that's just the nature of what it means to be in relationship, and what that all entails. And I think what enables that is the ability just to have really honest conversations, and through that process to build trust.
Malik next.
Yeah, when we talk about our community, I think I guess talk about the relationship with the First Nation. We talked about a lot of the conversations we had with leadership on the onset, and how we can help. I think we were very used to face-to-face interaction, all formal meetings and what have you. I think like other reserves in this country, unfortunately, there isn't widespread broadband internet in the community, and that continues to provide some challenges when it comes to communication through Zoom and Teams and what have you. But overall, I think the relationship has strengthened. We're dealing with a new leadership at the Mikisew Cree First Nation. We have been for about 9 months or so, and I think overall, events like this make people make relationships stronger and really shows a sense of community and we're all in this together type attitude.
That's me. I remember from the opposite direction. I would say that we would have to ask the community group of companies what their view is. And so Malik, I think from your perspective, you've answered that. We try always to work on strong relationships, to have early engagement and as much transparent communication as possible. We did it, pre-pandemic, response to pandemic, through recovery. So I think that we've got stronger relationships with the economic development groups and Indigenous suppliers, but in saying that, there's reduced work and less opportunity. So, less opportunity that's starting to ramp up. So I would say we have to ask of them, but we do aim to hit those 3 important values.
I would say our relationships have broadened. An opportunity that came with COVID is you don't need to fly somewhere, or you can't drive somewhere, and you can't meet in person. It's jump on Zoom like we're all doing right now. And so it became this amazing opportunity to actually connect with so many groups that otherwise we would have planned for months in advance. And working on the Emergency Community Support Fund with the Red Cross and the United Way Centre Canada, we were able to fund over 12,000 projects right across the country. And so just the introduction and awareness and connection with so many organizations. But I would also say stepping into that space and responding to community in a time of crisis, as it should happen, we were also called to account for our practices and our ways. And it was a moment for us to walk the walk and to admit when we're stumbling over principles of equity and trying to respond in an emergency. So I would say our partners, new and older, really helped strengthen us as an organization and as a network over the past 15 months.
Thank you. The next question here is one from Rocco, and let's maybe start, Melanie, straight back to you. And what's the group see as the priority regarding community needs and support post-pandemic?
Yeah, I would say talk to your community foundation. They have incredible insights and data and connections to community about really localizing what the community needs are. And so please reach out to them. They would love to chat with you and really make sure that they're talking about what's most relevant. But I think for all businesses in this time of innovation and this time of adapting, there is opportunities to look at your own organization, and Malik and Debbie talk so eloquently about the supply chain and what that looks like, and opportunities to look beyond to other communities to work with. But I think things like hiring practices and governance and employee flexible options, like there's so much you can look at within your organization, which is absolutely part of community recovery. And just how do you create a space and a business that allows individuals to thrive?
Malik, maybe you can pick it up from there.
Yeah, I think we learned we can do more remotely, as Melanie mentioned. The need to travel to meet, to feel a sense of connection, I think has changed. Our company, like most companies, the bulk of the administration folks have transitioned to, or very early on transitioned to, working from home. I think there's a challenge that comes with the nature of that work, and building a sense of building your culture and a sense of community and what have you when you're not seeing people as frequently as you were. Debbie, as an example, I think we've talked almost weekly for the last year and a half, but haven't seen each other face to face for 15 months. And it's I think it's easier with existing relationships, obviously, but harder in building new relationships. But what comes with this is I think we've learned that, there were a lot of organizations that are already down the path of working remotely. I think there's definitely a need for organizations to be flexible when it comes to their workforce. I think, we've learned that we can work effectively and efficiently remotely, and I think that's going to create some really exciting job opportunities. When you look at our community, there's a significant remoteness attached to the community of Fort Chipewyan, and hopefully, we can hire people that work from the community of Fort Chipewyan in administration functions and do that just as effectively. So yeah, definitely looking forward to the future. I think there will be a sense of excitement for folks to get back to normal and come back to the office. I think a lot of people are really fatigued from this, but we'll hopefully get back to normal soon.
Maybe Debbie next, and then Laurie.
Sure. So I would say that we are as committed as ever for working with Indigenous businesses across Canada. And what we're seeing is just such an exciting energy and not energy from non-Indigenous suppliers to understand how and why they should be doing it as well. So we lean in with them on when they build their Indigenous strategies. And it can mean ownership, it can mean subcontract work, it can mean strong social responsibility practices. So we're here for that, and we will learn from all of our suppliers and share what we know, and encourage business development across the country. Over to you, Laurie.
Thanks, Debbie. And I guess in response to the question, there's not much more that I would add, like to what Melanie had said, other than I mean, just another kind of observation of mine, I guess, over the last year is that how quickly things are evolving. And so I think, community foundations, community leaders, are obviously the first place I would go to for understanding what the emerging needs are. But it feels like that all of that evolves so quickly that I think what I would just say is it's really important to stay in constant conversation with. So it's not as simple as saying, what is the need today? I'll just go out and consult with somebody and find that out. But it's what get in relationship with the communities that you are a part of or serve, to really understand and stay in conversation and relationship because it just is, things evolve so quickly. It's hard to, what was important yesterday might be not important tomorrow. So that would just be my only addition to Melanie's point.
What about sort of the conversation as we sort of look, what are the challenges of the next year? Let's go a little bit longer term now for a couple minutes. And how do we take the past 15 months and all the challenges and lessons that we've learned over those 15 months? How do we now all work together to turn it into an opportunity to establish stronger, more resilient communities for the long term? How do we really put that into practice to make sure that we are coming back stronger and that it's sustainable and that we'll have these resilient communities for many years to come? Malik, maybe you tackle that one first.
Yeah, good question. I think, again, we talked about what diversification meant for our business during this challenge, and really how we realized how really important that is for any business, but in our case in particular, what it means when it comes to distributions and stuff and such to the First Nations. So yeah, I think long term, we're looking at how do we earn passive income for the First Nation on investments such as the East Tank Farm, and we have another investment in a power line that a very similar structure. I think in our region, really the respective communities realize the importance of that, and a lot of them talk very openly about the need for diversification, and still working very closely in maximizing on the opportunities and growing our existing businesses in our sector, but placing an emphasis on that. So we're really looking forward to that. Again, we're hoping. Obviously, again, in our sector, there's a sense of optimism when it comes to oil prices where they are and what opportunities hopefully that brings in the near and long term. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Melanie, maybe jump in there.
Yeah, I think to add to that, we absolutely need a healthy economy to create resilient communities. And I think a healthy, thriving economy looks like healthy and thriving for all. And so ways, we've seen all across the country how small and medium-sized businesses have been hit so hard during COVID. And so ways that we can strengthen that sector has ripple effects throughout community. Additionally, I would say if you're looking both in business, but also from a philanthropic lens, invest in organizations and leaders who represent the communities they serve. Communities know what they need. Go to them, give them the decision-making, relinquish the control there and support them in their work. I'd also say just, look at yourself to see if there's ways to pivot your business to have both financial sustainability, but as well as social and environmental outcomes. We really do need to have a more holistic approach to business. And when you're looking at even the charitable sector, there's increasing opportunities to be an investor and to work in the social finance space so that charities, nonprofits can also pivot to find more financially resilient ways of working.
Thanks. Lori and then Debbie.
Thanks. If I just pick up off of Melanie's comments, and draw on something that we also said is just reduced resources require us to be more efficient. So some of the things that Melanie was just talking about is a beautiful way of being able to take limited resources, put them back in the hands of the people who know what's needed for a greater resilience, rather than trying to recreate a program or recreate a program in-house in a company to do what the community knows how to do best. I think that's when I think about from a business perspective with limited resources and wanting to contribute into community and what it means to be resilient. I think that would be a really important move, and examining your own practices and how you also are contributing to. So it's one thing to be contributing and supporting the kind of change that's required for community resilience, and then what are your own practices that are also helping enable or empower that as well. So probably restating things that Melanie and Malik have both said, but sharing it from my perspective.
Super. So I think that's one thing that we definitely did learn in the past 15 months is sustainable business is just critical. And so as we go forward, it's all the things that Malik talked about. The diversification, the deeper engagement, like the capital investment, percentage of employment, not only understanding what it is and tracking it, but also, looking to increase it of Indigenous employment, and being able to clearly articulate what your value proposition is as well. So knowing your business, deeper engagement, and that diversification, and that'll just take us along on the journey. So I would say take a page out of Mikisew Group of Companies book, and there's some really good learnings there in the past couple of years for sure.
This next one, I'd like to do it as a bit of a rapid fire, just looking at the clock here, and that we only have a couple minutes left. And there's two questions I actually want to ask still here. One is this first one. We had a number of questions come in regarding SMEs, retail, technology, other companies. So if there's one thing that a business could do to make the biggest difference, and keeping in mind that SME and other sectors perspective, what would that one thing be? Let's just go reverse order again. So Debbie, one thing.
Summarize that question again for me. One thing an Indigenous business company can do to what?
Not necessarily Indigenous business. What's one thing that businesses could do, SME, retail, technology, et cetera? What's one thing that they could do to make the biggest difference in addressing the challenges that we're facing?
Understand their value proposition and be able to articulate it. What are they after?
Lori.
Right. I guess just listen deeply and engage meaningfully with your communities, and that includes your internal community employees.
Malik.
I like Debbie's answer. I think that's important. I think understand the values of the organizations that you work with, and understand the what and why of businesses and your internal business as well. I think understanding, listen to your people, listen to your folks on the front lines, and really grow and develop from that.
And Melanie.
I think change happens with real honest conversations. And so I'd say start with talking to your staff and employees and what we're seeing as issues in our country. What does that look like in your business? And what are you seeing? What are you not seeing? What are you not hearing in your organization? And that tells you something too.
Thank you for that. I think that's the sort of practical advice that I think a lot of folks listening in today will really appreciate hearing specifically. The last question I want to put to each of you, and we'll end on this, and you have about 60 seconds each to answer. You're all leaders in your organizations, in communities, and indeed in business across Canada. And so I want to put it to you, and we've asked people this question in our own conversations and our own relationships a lot of ways over the last year. And it's, how are you managing over the last year at this time? How are you doing? What are you feeling? What do you think the future holds? How are you managing as a leader in this time? Melanie.
I am both exhausted and excited. You feel the Zoom life of 15 months, you feel the staying indoors more than being out with people. But, I think that there is kind of a whiteboard that's happening, and the blueprint of the past has been wiped away. And like, we really genuinely have an opportunity to do something different. And we have an opportunity to pivot the way the course that Canada was going in a better way. And so I both feel like we need to take care of our personal health and our personal well-being, but oh my goodness, am I excited about the opportunity of where we can be in 10 years.
Malik.
Yeah, on a personal note through the pandemic, and I think the change of pace was almost nice. 2 young daughters at home. We had a COVID baby actually, so I was really used to being on the road 2 or 3 nights a week, and that gets exhausting with the family and what have you. So it was really nice over the last 15 months to spend some time with the girls and be home a little bit more. Professionally, I think again, I think we're really optimistic about what we can do in our region, and I think what Indigenous businesses can do in this country coming out of this pandemic. Really optimistic on some of the the ESG initiatives and sustainability initiatives ultimately, and what that means for organizations like ourselves. So,
Debbie.
Yeah, I agree. Both with Malik and Melanie. Melanie, I'm gonna play your words back to you, because I agree with everything you said about being excited. We had a choice during COVID, and we, myself, my family, the people I work with, we chose to pivot and we chose to proceed. So super excited about what comes.
Lori, words of wisdom to leave us with.
There's some
no pressure.
I find I'm really leaning into the discomfort and learning from this time, and I'm learning to be okay with all of that too. I'm reflecting a lot on what it means to be a wholehearted leader, because you can't help but not be in this time. You're inviting people into your living space every day, multiple times a day. And it's really easy to do that when it's good times, and the real learning comes when it's difficult times like now. And so someone I work with occasionally refers to this as, has this lovely saying of around clumsily moving off in the right direction. I kind of feel like that every day. And I try to do that in a good way every day too.
I think those are good words of wisdom. So well done. I really want to take a minute just to thank everyone for taking some time today to listen in. And a big thanks to each of you, our presenters, Lori Hewson, Debbie Noseworthy, Malik Eid, and Melanie Thomas. And on behalf of the Canadian Chamber of Commerce, I do want to offer a virtual tip of the cap to your organizations, Suncor Energy Foundation, the Mikisew Group of Companies, and Community Foundations of Canada. All of your teams have exemplified the spirit of coming together that has been so important to all of us over the last year. Together with other members and partners, the Canadian Chamber of Commerce is committed to creating real solutions to help Canadian businesses and the Canadians they employ beat COVID-19 and return to economic health. You can learn more about all of these activities at businessledrecovery.ca. Thanks again, everyone, and do take care.